As you've heard, the United States now has a carrier strike group positioned near Iran, and Iran says it has the finger on the trigger. How close are we, Admiral, in your view, to a military confrontation?
Well, I don't know. It's difficult to say, Dan. The rhetoric has been heating up for some time now. You're well aware that the U.S. and Israel both struck Iran earlier, about 6 months ago. And it's pretty obvious that the reaction of the regime to the protest and the slaughter of evidently many thousands of people in the streets have got President Trump spun up again. So it's difficult to say. The U.S. has been pulling in some forces, obviously, to intimidate the Iranians and to try to get them to come to some agreement. I don't know exactly what the proposals may be that have been put forth. Obviously, something to do with a nuclear agreement. And President Trump's also several times mentioned the actions against the people in the street. So exactly what the aim of this particular escalation is rather difficult to say.
And of course, President Trump says that he hopes Iran will make a deal. As you say, we don't know exactly what a deal could look like here, but the president has also said that he would intervene if necessary, so maintaining that threat against this regime. Admiral, can you paint a picture of what intervention may actually look like? You're aware of the US military assets across the region. You have an intimate knowledge of what the United States is actually capable of. What do you think it could do next?
Sure. Well, everyone's been focused on the arrival of the carrier strike group from the Pacific. It's in the area now. There are also a number of other ships that are already there and land-based assets. It was made a little bit more challenging by the information that came out today that indicated that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were not interested in allowing U.S. access to their airspace. That might cause a little bit of change in plan, but if there is, in fact, a plan to strike, the U.S. has a fair number of assets. But I'd say this. This isn't going to, in my opinion, usher the regime out the door. I would suspect these will be for a very specific purpose. There's probably some work left to be done after the strikes on the nuclear sites last year, and also there's quite a bit of damage to the Iranian air defenses, but I would expect they would have patched some of that together again. So exactly what the near-term objectives will be, we're just going to have to wait and see if, in fact, there is any military action. But right now, we're in the kind of war of words, the escalation of rhetoric, and I think it remains to be seen just what happens. It's clear that the neighborhood, the Gulf Arabs, are not interested in an open conflict, certainly one that brings them into it. But on the other hand, there's been long-standing anxiety about Iranian behavior going back 30, 40 plus years now. So when I was out there in the region, all of the neighbors asked me to do something about Iran. And when I said, well, what would you like me to do? And the answer was, we're not sure, but you've got to keep them in check, but don't start another war. So they kind of like to have their cake and eat it too. They like the regime to be gone, but there's really no appetite for a widespread conflict, and that's pretty understandable.
Admiral, you mentioned the most important word there, which is strategy. And I wanted to ask you about this in particular because your new book really argues that the US repeatedly chose tactics over strategy after 9/11. When you look at this situation in the Middle East today, do you think we may be repeating that same mistakes now with Iran that you saw after 9/11? That is, pressure first, political pressure first, and then strategy later.
I'm afraid that you're probably spot on. In my experience, there's often little forethought given to the long-term effects of specific actions. So we've had a long period to study Iran. We've had about 45 years now of animosity and friction between our two countries. One would think by now we'd have some objectives lined up, and that may be the case, but it appears that right now there's a desire to do something and to smack the regime for their recent actions. And so whether step 2, step 3, step 4 have been thought out is a good question. And the history is not good in that regard.
Indeed. And, the question that regional investors are also asking is, what is the day after plan? Admiral, you just suggested that this potential move from the United States is unlikely to usher out this regime. Do you believe that President Donald Trump wants regime change in Iran?
I think he'd love it, but whether that's going to happen right now is an open question. The Iranians in this position are pretty vulnerable, I think, to a lot of pressure. They're under tremendous economic strain. I believe that was the primary instigation of the unrest and the protests in the streets recently. They're not particularly well off. They've been burned pretty badly in the region. Their surrogates, Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen have taken a lot of shots to the chin and have been pretty quiet, frankly, for the last several months. So I think the Iranians are back on their heels, but it's not to say that they're about to collapse. And they've got my opinion, a really tight grip on the population. They still enjoy support in many quarters of the country, but they are vulnerable right now. And I think that President Trump probably senses that vulnerability and would like to move, and one never knows. But from where I sit, I have yet to see a viable alternative to the current government. People say, well, could be the IRGC might stage a coup. Well, that's just exchanging one for another. They've been empowered by the regime for decades and have reached their position of influence and power through the regime. So they're pretty much wedded at the hip. And I think any idea that group would suddenly change course or pick a different course of action regarding the neighborhood or the U.S., I think is wishful thinking.